Hello, I'm Associate Professor Janet Hunt from the Australian National University. The individual deprivation measure is an individual measure of multidimensional poverty, which is sensitive to gender and able to identify which social groups are affected by poverty and how. It assesses poverty across 14 dimensions that matter to poor men and women. Most dimensions are measured using a number of indicators, which are brought together into up to 4 themes: just food insecurity, family planning, and time use are measured using only one indicator. Dimension scores are split into 4 categories, ranging from most deprived, deprived, somewhat deprived, to least deprived. Then we calculate an overall IDM index by aggregating the scores on every dimension to provide an overall score of multidimensional poverty. In 2019, a research team from the Australian National University, working with the South African survey organisation, Ikapadata, undertook an IDM study in South Africa. We surveyed over 8,650 men and women, all over the age of 16 years, across all provinces. The results provide rich insights into the way poverty affects people's lives, and it shows that gender matters. To respond to poverty effectively, we need to know how it impacts differently on women and on men. The idea of the feminization of poverty has been much discussed since the UN Women's Conference in Nairobi in 1985. This is the idea that more women are poor, or that poverty impacts more on women, or that women are becoming increasingly poor. Our research finds that on average, women in South Africa are more likely to be multidimensionally poor than men. And this is because they're more deprived than men in 6 of the 14 dimensions: food, health, sanitation, relationships, environment, and time use. But the picture has more complexity than this. In the 7 dimensions where the results are relatively equal, water, shelter, education, energy, clothing and footwear, voice and work, there are also some themes where gender differences are noticeable, but in some, men are worse off, and in others, it's women who are more deprived. Before I discuss these differences, on one dimension, family planning, men score slightly more deprived than women. This is partly because many refused to answer the question and were coded deprived. And although approximately equal numbers of men and women are categorized most deprived, that is, they experience an unmet need for contraception, clearly being unable to access contraception has far more serious consequences for women than men. Looking within some of the dimensions, we also find gendered patterns of poverty. For example, women are more deprived than men in themes within dimensions such as housing crowdedness, cooking energy, and particularly rural women, and perception of raising concerns in the community. Men, on the other hand, are more deprived than women in themes such as functional literacy, hand-washing facilities, and basic clothing. Thus, the IDM is clearly able to reveal the gendered nature of poverty. That is, how gender roles and responsibilities shape women's and men's experiences of poverty. Let's take a look at just 3 dimensions: environment, time use, and voice, to illustrate this more. In the environment dimension, there are 3 themes: exposure to environmental problems, natural resource utilization, and safe environment. men and women experienced exposure to environmental problems equally, and similarly with respect to natural resource utilisation. The most significant gender difference is found in the safe environment theme. While scores are generally low, only 20% of men are least deprived in this theme, and a very low 7% of women are in this category. In fact, 48% of women are deprived or most deprived, compared to 28% of men. These individuals feel unsafe or very unsafe when at home alone and/or while walking alone in the neighbourhood, or in both situations in the case of those most deprived. Clearly relating to women's gendered roles, the time use dimension shows women more deprived. More than 3 times as many women are in the most deprived category compared to men, 8% of men and 27% of women. These individuals spend at least a third of their time on call, that is, caring for a child under 13 or a sick, aged or disabled person, whilst also spending at least 10.5 hours a day on work for pay, profit and production, unpaid domestic and care work, and other obligatory activities. Finally, in the voice dimension, men, and especially young people, are more deprived than women in the indicator related to voting. But women are more deprived than men in their perception of their capacity to raise concerns with local decision makers. So if we look within just 3 dimensions, environment, time use, and voice, we see poverty and deprivation shaping and constraining the lives of women and men, sometimes in rather different ways. While poverty is shaped by gender, there are some aspects of poverty that relate to biology and reproduction, which are specific to women. The IDM is the only mainstream measure of poverty that assesses women's deprivation in regard to prenatal care, access to contraception, and access to sanitary products. The theme in the clothing dimension relating to access to sanitary products reveals that a third of menstruating women do not always have enough sanitary products to meet their needs. This contributes to women's lower scores than men on participation in community events, a theme in the relationships dimension. There, almost 1 in 5 menstruating women have insufficient sanitary products and therefore miss social activities, education, or work, or they miss activities because of stigma associated with menstruation, or both. And the prenatal care theme in health revealed that of 459 women who'd given birth in the 12 months prior to the survey or were pregnant, 28% faced between 2 and 7 types of problems accessing prenatal health care, of whom a very small number were unable to access that care at all. The findings from the IDM study in South Africa provide deep and nuanced insights into the ways in which poverty plays out for women and men and across different age groups, geographic locations, and depending on disability status. Our findings suggest that women in South Africa are overall more multidimensionally poor than men, and that both men and women experience poverty, often very deep poverty, but they experience it differently. Sometimes those differences are due to biological and reproductive roles. Often they result from gender roles and responsibilities. Responding effectively to poverty requires assessing which groups are vulnerable and how. The IDM findings from South Africa demonstrate the importance of individual measurement of multidimensional poverty to inform policies and programs in our efforts to end poverty and ensure no one is left behind. You can find more details about the IDM in general, about the South African study and an Indonesian study at the IDM website. For the South African study, there are videos and briefing notes on the methodology, the overall findings, the analysis by age, as well as the analyses by disability and by rural and urban locality.